Welcome. I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel. First off, I wanted to say thank you to all of my patrons who have been so amazingly supportive of my work and for allowing me to bring you these videos and other instructional materials about astrology and magic. Of course, patrons do get something for their contributions. They get early access to all of my videos and materials, as well as access to certain exclusive materials and videos that the public never sees. Another thing that patrons get is a monthly Q&A with me, where we talk about astrology and magic, and I answer questions about these subjects live. So before we begin, I wanted to give you a little bit of a background. So my patrons and other people that have emailed me and texted me over the years often ask a very common question. I think this is probably the number one question that I receive when it comes to astrological magic. That question is, what do I do when a talisman impacts my natal chart in a potentially negative manner? Another variant of this question is, can I work with a planet magically that is afflicted in my natal chart? And the answer to that is, it really doesn't seem to make a huge difference. That can be very shocking, I think, for some of us, because many, if not all of us, came to astrological magic having started out with natal astrology. But it's important to recognize that in traditional astrology, natal wasn't as big a part of the practice of astrology as it is today. Today, it's very much the foundational part of astrology that all of us learn when we get started. But in reality, historically, lots of people didn't know what time they were born, sometimes not even the date of birth. And another element of it was that the talisman makers and the books that they have left us, such as the Picatrix, for example, or the 3 books of occult philosophy, they all just say, just make these talismans this way. They don't really tell you to consult the natal chart. Now, I suppose one could say, well, the authors actually left the best stuff out because it was part of an oral tradition. And that's always possible, but we don't really have any corroborating evidence. It's not like we have one author who does mention this and then the rest are silent on the topic of natal and magical interaction. So I think what's going on is that this simply doesn't seem to have been considered very much, if at all, by astrological magicians of history. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't consider it, but one of the things that I always point out is often in our lives, when things are not going well, we might be having a challenging transit or other activation of a debilitated planet in our chart. And yet, these are often the very times that we might want to make a talisman to minimize some of these negative effects. So if that's the case, we could never make a talisman to remediate a problem in our lives, because there's a very, very high probability that there's something going on astrologically in our charts that would actually emphasize and trigger our chart in a negative way. So I think it's important to have a little bit of courage and to be a little bit less conservative when it comes to the natal chart. Instead, I think it's much more important to be very critical and skeptical when it comes to the quality of the election that we choose. I think that having taught some classes on this topic, I think that if students of astrological magic and novices to this field spent more effort on critiquing the difficult points of these electional magical charts, they would generally have a much better outcome than if they worried about how this particular talisman might be square their natal Neptune or something like that. So in terms of where to put your effort and where to put your concern, it's much more important to become a very good astrologer when it comes to electional magic, electing, of course, for magical purposes, than it is to worry about exactly how it impacts the natal chart. I often tell a story of having a very debilitated planet in my own natal chart, and yet I once finally, after much hemming and hawing, made a talisman for it some years ago, and it actually turned out to be the most interesting and coolest ritual I ever did, And the resulting talisman was one of the most powerful and life-changing talismans in a good way that I had ever made. So I think it's important to be a little bit more open and a little bit less frightened of one's own chart, and a little bit more critical of the various charts that could be proposed for a talisman as a standalone horoscope. I hope this was helpful, and I hope this gives you some ideas. Again, you're welcome to contact me with questions. Certainly you're welcome to leave them as comments, or if you're a patron, you can always contact me via Patreon. All right, thanks again.